Welcome to One Way to Machines and the B7 Audi RS4 series. Most of the time, if you're working with the manifold, it's best to have the inlet of the inlet manifold hanging off of your table, because in that way the manifold is much more stable. If you need to put it all on the table, you can, but if you're careful, you can leave it like this and it's not going to rock back and forth and slip. Also, with all of the vacuum lines and evap lines that are still attached to it, to avoid damaging those. So we're looking at the bottom of the intake manifold right now, and you can see that it's actually two pieces. So there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 bolts that hold the bottom piece to it. I didn't find torque specs for this anywhere, and I haven't taken it apart. There really is no reason to take it apart because all the components that could go bad are not located inside. Next, we're going to take a look at the side of the intake manifold that is closest to the front of the car. The intake manifold is flipped upside down, so what you see here would all be not visible when the intake manifold's installed in the car. So these two are vacuum actuators for the intake manifold flaps. They use vacuum and they move this arm in and out on each bank, giving variable intake flaps. There are reports of these arms breaking on these. The ones on this car seem quite solid and in good shape, and there are aftermarket companies that build metal arms for these. These are the two sensors that we removed from the front, one with the pick, one with the flathead screwdriver. This one is a sensor to show if the vacuum actuators are working in the case that they fail. And there's also reports that these fail on some cars. This one here is the intake manifold runner flap sensor. We have the manifold still flipped upside down, and we're looking at the firewall side of the manifold. So one of the banks has that same manifold flap runner sensor on the other side of the manifold. So one is here and the other one's diagonally opposed at the front. At the very back here, this is the PCV inlet. So the PCV box recirculates the oil vapor and it comes in here, mixes in with the intake air and goes into the motor. These two ports here are what I was talking about when we were doing the carbon clean removal video, that there's a coolant line that comes in from here and that exits from here, which heats up the oil vapors going in here on cold days. And most people bypass this because this is very difficult to reinstall and disassemble properly. This hose here is the evap purge valve line in. So just leave that, don't tamper with it. You can tighten up the hose clamp again. In the video I took it off and then I remembered that you don't need to remove this. So leave it on so that it keeps its orientation. Just as long as you're careful when you're doing your reinstalls, all this stuff is best to stay in. The evap purge line in that I just told you guys about, on this one, now that I have the intake manifold out, is showing that it's actually cracked. I'll give you guys a closer view of that. As you can see right there, the line is cracked. The car also has an intermittent evap leak, and the evap purge valve has been changed, so this may be what the cause of those evap related codes are. The correct way of doing a smoke test on any vacuum system or evap system is with a smoke machine. In this case, we don't have a smoke machine with us here, so we're just going to use smoke from a cigarette or a cigar to see if this is actually leaking. And in order to do that, we're going to tape off the PCV port and the inlet ports here. If you are going to clean up around here, either do it with a microfiber towel if it's just oil residue, but if you have any kind of dirt, sand, silt, anything like that, take your gloves off and just use the oils on your finger to gently pick them up, clean it, come back and do the same thing. The first time I did the carbon clean on this particular RS4, inside on the motor side where this mates to the intake manifold gaskets, there was a lot of sand there. So I had to spend lots of time with my finger just gently cleaning up the sand. So be aware of the things that might be specific to the vehicle you're working on. So you guys have heard me use and talk about tuck tape a lot. The reason I like this stuff is because it really sticks even on angles. The only places that it is a bit difficult to get off of is if you were to tape this face here, or the same face that it mates to underneath the intake gaskets to maybe block it off if you're going to take a break from this project. When you come to take it off, there's a chance you're going to get little red residues, and you can't use anything metal to scrape it off of here. So you'll just kind of have to sit there with your fingernail and maybe just get some of the little residue off. So if you can avoid it, you don't tape this side or that side. And even if you are going to take a break from the job, I recommend just putting the intake manifold back on and leaving it there until you come back and then remove it again, because it'll seal it and prevent anything from falling into the motor. We're going to try the smoke test. Make sure to plug the pipe after you exhale the smoke in. You can exhale the smoke in, plug the pipe. Exhale in, plug the pipe until the intake manifold fills up, and then it'll show if it has any leaks. So the evap line, even though it has a crack, didn't show any leak. The smoke came out of some of the small holes from the tape, which goes to show that this actually does work. And we're going to go ahead and replace that line anyways, because it's cracked. You don't want to have to go back in there and change that again. Remove the tape now that we're done doing the vacuum test. In a future video with a different RS4, we're going to show the manifold deflap process. This manifold has already been deflapped, so I'm just going to go over everything that kind of was done and show you the old parts and where they were situated. Another test you want to do at this point is to check and see if there's any slight scratches or gouges around these openings here. Someone previously must have maybe sanded this or scratched it with something, as there are some. This stuff could also cause vacuum leaks, and the way to kind of see if it's within the vicinity of going past the rings, these rings on the gasket, is to look at the orientation of the gasket inside of the car, and then take your new gasket and test it and see how far the clearance comes and where the gouges end. I'll give you guys a zoom in on this one here. So these are just some of the slight gouges here. They do clear the material on the gasket. We'll also do another vacuum leak test when this is back on the car to see if anything is escaping from these places. The rest are pretty good. Here we have the pieces from the actual shafts inside. These are the flaps that are inside there. Each one is held on by two of these small torque screws. And on the car side, you have this divider that goes in before the valves, which if you're removing them, you just put needle nose pliers on it and you pull them straight out. If you keep the flaps in the car, you need to keep these, as the flaps rest on them when they open and close. If you're going to deflap it, you take them out completely. You don't put them back in the car. But this is what is inside there. And like I said, once we have another RS4 in here, we're going to do the full manifold deflap process and go through it for you guys. These are the friction fit metal cups or ports which provide access into the actual rotating shaft so that you can remove the screws that hold the flap in to the rotating shaft. You can just use a punch to knock them through and then out, or if you have this tool from 034, you just put them on here, hit it with the hammer, and they fall out. The good thing about this tool is that when you come to reinstall them, it has some grooves that allow you to push it into the correct spot. Doesn't push it in too far or too out, so I do recommend having this tool. These holes are small enough for you to be able to get a ratchet with a 1/4 inch bit in there, and you can put your, I think it's a T20 in there so that you can undo the screws. But the part that's very tricky about this is that those screws are going to be carboned up. And when you get it in there, I mean, at least when I did it on this one, the first two went very smooth. I put it in with my ratchet, it fit perfectly in the hole, and I was able to crack them loose and get them out. As soon as I got to the fourth or fifth one, it didn't work. It started to slip on the actual screw. So I got in there with some brake cleaner and a very small pick, and just have to keep cleaning the star bolt, keep cleaning the Torx bolt, keep cleaning it until it's clean enough that you can do it. Even when you do get it very clean, it might still slip. So it still kept slipping because there's only so much brake cleaner and so much that you can do with the pick in there. The carbon is very gummy and it's built up in there. So it just kept almost stripping the bolt, so I stopped doing that. The only thing that did end up working for me is I took a Allen key that had a T20 on the end and I held it with vice grips, and I went in from a specific angle because when you go in straight from the hole, your ratchet and your actual socket is going to be almost the same size as this hole. So when you go in with the actual Allen key, it's much smaller than this hole, and you can get a slight angle. You can change your angle, and then you clamp it down with vice grips, and then you just gently, slowly go at it until you can get it out. And I was able to get all the screws out. This here is the setup that I used to get the remaining screws out. Took a vice grip, has a T20 on the end. It's just an Allen key. And as you can see, you have a lot more maneuverability and angle to be able to really press it into the angle of approach for that screw that you're working with. I'm going to give you guys a zoom in on the screws that came out so that you can see how carboned up they really were. So here are the screws. As you can see, they're quite carboned up, and like I said, you can only do so much when they're in there with the brake cleaner and the small picks. But you got to do your best, be careful, and they did come out. All of them came out, so it's doable. When you come to reinstall these small friction fit metal cups, on the outside of them, before you put them back, with a very, very soft sandpaper, maybe something between 600 to 1000 grit, just lightly clean them up. That's it. And then you want to obviously clean it off with some alcohol or something. Make sure it's dry. And then put some red Loctite on there. And when you put the Loctite, go just a tad heavy with it so that it shows itself on the outside. As I don't know if it was a bad Loctite that I had run into, but it took about 2 or 3 days for it to actually dry. When I would put my finger in here, when I reinstall it on the car, it was still slightly wet. So have just a little bit of extra so you can keep an eye on it. But eventually they all dried, they haven't moved. And the 034 tool is very good for this because it presses right in and you pretty much get a nice fit. You can probably find a way to do it without this tool, but I would recommend that you have it. We're going to take the sensor off with 2 T20s. Okay guys, so the sensor on this side, at least the mechanical part, seems like it's in good shape. So that's not a problem there. We'll check the other sensor, but we're not going to remove the shaft because the actual arms, I'll give you a better close-up. One of them is tight and the other one has some play. It doesn't make sense that that should have any effect on the in and out motion of the actual flaps. But removing those arms at the front have some very delicate plastic tabs, and I still have the plastic arms on this particular intake manifold. So those are known to be brittle and do have a chance of breaking. Because we don't have the billet 034 parts in right now, we aren't going to do this on this intake manifold. Okay, so as you can see, the plastic tabs I'm talking about are these here. These hold the linkage arm on, and as you can see on this one, there's a lot of play in it, but it still does its back and forth motion. This one here has almost no play in it. Also, if you look under the bump stops for them, both of them have made some marks over time in the intake manifold. These things all could be a cause for concern. The original plan at the beginning of the video was to pull the shafts out and clean them. With the small amount of access there is to the piece of the rotating shaft from here, it's not worth spraying the brake cleaner in there and maybe getting in there with a pick, as it's probably just going to loosen up some carbon that can maybe fall into the motor. So we're going to wait until the second part of this series when we do install the billet arms for the vacuum actuators from 034. And then once we pull out the actual rotating shafts, we're going to clean them up then. So for now, we're going to put this back on the car. As a final note in part 1 of this series, earlier in the video I said that you should lean the intake manifold partially off of the table so that the vacuum actuators are not pressing onto the table, possibly causing damage to something or a vacuum line. Upon looking further, and I'll change the camera angle so that you guys can see, if you need to do something on the top, it's better to have 2 small pieces of 2x4 or plywood or something to rest on the manifold. Make sure it's wood so that it has some give and doesn't damage the metal, because there are more vacuum lines and more parts to that vacuum actuator system that will actually get the entire weight of the intake manifold on them, possibly causing a small crack in a hose, and then you'll have to take it all apart again to find that in case you miss it. So just to be on the safe side, do something like this. So now I'm going to change the camera angle so you guys can see. This piece here is attached just a small vacuum line, and it's very flimsy. In the case that you were to put all the weight on it, could crack something. So this is kind of what it is, just 2 small pieces of 2x4 on each side. Now I'll flip it around again so that I can show it to you guys more clearly. This right here will take all of the weight. Make sure to put it on blocks. That there, and you also don't want to possibly crack these or damage any other lines. So just be careful with it.